Hey guys, I got my replacement parts in the mail, and now it's time to figure out how to reassemble the engine. Before we put things back together, let's go over the major milestones in the engine reassembly process. Transmission, countershaft oil seal, bond the crankcase, right side components, left side components, piston, cylinder, head, cams, and valve cover. I'll put links to timestamps in the video description if you want to skip ahead. Overall, it felt like the reassembly process was way easier than the disassembly, probably because I kinda knew how and where the parts are supposed to go since I had done the disassembly. That might be why the service manual doesn't actually give much information about the reassembly. It just says to disassemble it in reverse. Even so, there were a couple gotchas where I had to review my notes and videos of the disassembly to make sure I got it all back together right. Anyhow, hopefully this video is helpful to somebody someday. Right, before we start slapping parts together, we need to address first run lubrication. Assuming we get this thing running again, the wear surfaces have to have lubrication before the engine starts running. During normal operation, the oil system will be fully primed and oil is immediately delivered to where it needs to be, but for the first few moments after the full disassembly, the oil won't be there at all. So we need to apply some sort of tacky grease so the engine can run for a minute without tearing itself apart. Because of this, the service manual calls for molybdenum oil solution in a variety of places. The first chapter of the service manual explains that molybdenum oil solution is a 50-50 mix of engine oil and molybdenum disulfide grease. As it turns out, molybdenum disulfide grease is kinda hard to find. Is this it? It says paste, but the service manual doesn't call out this part number. This stuff is made by Yamaha, sounds about right, but it isn't sold online. So I went to a couple of authorized resellers in my area. Nobody had any. I was hesitant to use generic engine assembly grease because the CBR300 has a wet clutch and I wasn't sure if the eventual mixing and distribution of the non-recommended grease would be a problem. I spoke with two different powersports dealership service centers and both said it doesn't matter, just use a thin film of engine assembly grease. One of them had pity on me and gave me a few ounces of their preferred engine reassembly grease in a styrofoam cup, so I'm just going to use that stuff. Anyhow, we need to apply a thin film of this to most smooth bearing surfaces. Let's start with the transmission. I pulled the transmission stack out and disassembled the whole thing to get the molybdenum oil solution into the specified locations. A couple things worth noting. You'll need snap ring pliers. The ones I use are from Harbor Freight and run about $5. Don't forget to oil all the gear teeth. And don't forget to align the snap ring gaps with the gaps in the gears. You'll notice I said don't forget. That's because I forgot to the first time and I had to pull the crankcase apart to redo this. Something I noticed during the redo was this oil hole. I made sure to line it up even though the service manual doesn't say anything about it. My reason for aligning it is that the geared or splined interface is not rubbing, so it needs less lubrication than the bushing interface. So aligning the holes will allow more oil flow to the bushing interface more easily. Once the transmission is all reassembled and lubed up, you should be able to manually rotate the gear selector through all the gears relatively easily. Next up, the countershaft oil seal. The countershaft oil seal is super easy to pull out if the crankcase is separated. Use snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring and grab a flathead screwdriver to pop out the old oil seal. Clean and oil the sealing faces before popping in the new one. If you need to replace your countershaft oil seal, you don't actually need to tear the engine all the way down. Just drill a small hole through the seal and put a slightly larger screw through it and use the screw like a handle to pull out the old oil seal. New seal installation is the same either way. Bonding the crankcase. I'll give the bonding surfaces one last wipe down with acetone just in case any of the oil or grease touched it, and I'll have the crankcase bolts handy because we'll need them right after the case halves go together. Also, need to double check that the dowel pins are in place, and we need to apply engine oil to a new O-ring and place it right here. I'm using Honda Bond, a high temperature silicone adhesive / sealant. I'm confident that there are other liquid gasket type materials that could be used, but this is what the dealership recommended. I need to apply a light but thorough coating of sealant along the specified mating surface. Basically as little as possible to minimize squeeze out into the crankcase, but still maintain full coverage to actually seal the interface. I used a piece of the blister pack as my squeegee for smearing around the silicone. With that, we'll take the other half of the crankcase and carefully place it. Don't force it. If it's not dropping in, it just means that something isn't aligned yet. Once it drops in place, we can install the crankcase bolts. Use a crisscross pattern and approach the final torque in 2 to 3 steps. I couldn't actually find the final torque for the crankcase bolts in the service manual, so I torqued to 7 foot-pounds. At this point, we can now return the engine to the engine stand. Now we can install the crank-driven gear and the balancer-driven gear assembly. Prior to installing the balancer-driven gear assembly, make sure to align the through hole. I don't have a 3mm pin, so I just used an awl. Slide the balancer-driven gear assembly onto the balancer shaft splines and mesh the gear teeth with the crank-driven gear, which would then maintain the alignment. Also, be sure that the punch mark on these two gears align. We need to torque the balancer-driven gear assembly nut to 32 foot-pounds. The service manual says to apply engine oil to the threads and the seating face. This will reduce friction while torquing and result in a higher clamping force from the nut. I anti-rotated the balancer shaft by stuffing a shop towel in the crankcase. We also need to install the timing sprocket. It slides onto the crankshaft splines and will only fit when you align the extra wide inner gear gap with the pin punch on the end of the crankshaft. I poured some engine oil into the plastic baggie where I was keeping my timing chain and worked it around a bit to get an even layer of oil all over every link. With the timing sprocket in place, we can hang the timing chain on it. Now is a good opportunity to install the timing chain guide. It's held on by just one bolt. From there, we can install the rest of the components that go onto the right side of the engine. That's the clutch side. I started with the oil pump. Double check that the O-ring sealing surface is free of any dirt or debris and wipe on some new engine oil. Then just push the oil pump into place and tighten the bolts. Next, slide the oil pump gear into place. No fasteners required. It's driven by the primary drive gear, and that fits over the crankshaft splines. You don't need to worry about double checking alignment because there is a gap in the splines which will only slide into place when it is correctly aligned. The primary drive gear is held in place by a nut that is torqued up to 80 foot-pounds, so I clamped the stand to the workbench and stuffed the shop towel again. Next up, I installed the gear shift linkage stopper plate. When installing the stopper arm, ensure that the spring catch is correctly engaged. With those pieces in place, you can slide the gear shift spindle assembly in from the right side all the way through the engine so it pokes out through the left. It should have just a little spring pressure on it once it engages with the stopper plate and arm. Now we can turn our attention to the clutch. Start by applying some molybdenum oil solution to the shaft and then installing the needle bearings and the outer basket, followed by the inner hub. These are held in place by the center clutch nut. This particular nut also has a feature to prevent self-loosening. It's a thin rim that needs to get bent down into the crankshaft groove. This is called staking and basically means you can't reuse this nut. I used an auto punch to deform the rim. With the clutch nut in place, we can oil and install the rest of the clutch assembly, the lifter piece, the judder spring, and all of the clutch plates. Notice that the first clutch plate has a much narrower friction pad than all of the rest. That's so it won't interfere with the judder spring, the thing that looks like a giant washer. If your plates got out of order, just make sure the judder spring goes in first, the narrow pad next, and then alternate back and forth between plain steel plates and pad plates. The last clutch plate in should be a pad plate. Once everything is in there, you can put on the clutch lifter plate, which is held in place by the 5 clutch springs and bolts. These get torqued to 9 foot-pounds and should be approached in a crisscross pattern in a couple of steps. Once the clutch bolts are fully installed, you can prepare to install the right crankcase cover. This is your chance to replace O-rings and also make sure that the hollow dowel pin is correctly positioned. The O-rings are super important because those are functionally the only barrier between the oil and the antifreeze. If you are leaving in the old O-rings, make sure they are clean and in good condition. The clutch cover gasket is kind of big and floppy, so it might make more sense to lay the engine on its side instead of doing it upright like I did. Either way, once everything is aligned, you can install the right side cover bolts. Keep in mind there will be 2 empty spots, here and here. That's where the clutch cable bracket bolts go once we've got the engine back in the bike frame. Next up, the left side components. That's the alternator side. Let's first put on the starter motor. Need to make sure that the O-ring is free from dirt and debris, and then put some new engine oil on it and then just push it in. 2 bolts hold it down. Next up is the flywheel. We'll apply some molybdenum oil solution, install the needle bearings, and then push the flywheel into place. This will be held in place by the flywheel bolt. To prevent the flywheel from rotating, I'm using the shop towel trick again, and I'll clamp the engine to the workbench. Torque to 94 foot-pounds. Next, apply some molybdenum oil solution to the starter motor reducing gear shaft and slide the gear and shaft into place between the flywheel and starter motor. Last, on the right side, is to install the cover. We need to line up the dowel pins, hold the new gasket in place, and slide the cover on. The magnetic attraction from the alternator will try to pull it in at the last second, which makes the alignment a little more challenging. Once the cover was in place, I torqued the left side cover bolts to 7 foot-pounds. Don't forget to route the wire downwards and plug it in. Piston. Now that the entire bottom end is back together, we can start on the top end. First up, we need to put the piston on the end of the connecting rod. But before that, we need to pre-lube and install the piston rings. After applying a generous amount of oil to the piston ring groove and piston rings, we can install them. When installing the piston rings, minimize the amount of distortion to avoid damage, and also be certain that the correct rings go in the appropriate grooves. The topmost ring has a very slight rounded edge profile, and the second ring has a subtle bevel, where the wider edge needs to be down. A good way to ensure that the orientation is correct is to keep the markings face up. They're pretty faint laser markings, but if you look close enough you can see them. The third groove is home to 3 separate rings, a corrugated spacer, and 2 side rails. Start by installing the spacer, and then install the side rails. Once all the rings are in place, adjust them within each groove such that the gaps are misaligned as much as possible. This will create what's called a tortuous path and will help minimize the escape of combustion gases during each power stroke while the engine is in operation. With the rings on the piston, we can apply molybdenum oil solution to the wrist pin and the underside of the piston. After the molybdenum oil solution is in place, start by installing one of the wrist pin clips, then align the piston to the connecting rod and slide the wrist pin in. This next step could be the most difficult step in the entire rebuild process. With everything slathered in molybdenum oil solution, now you need to install the other wrist pin clip. This is really difficult to film, but basically what you want to do is hold one end of the wrist pin clip in place and work it into the groove incrementally from your start point all the way around. Throughout this process, make sure you maintain pressure on your start point or the spring will fly out and across the shop. After both clips are in place, adjust their position within the groove such that the clip gap is misaligned with the piston cutout. Now we can turn our attention to the cylinder. Before we get too far here, we need to swap over the timing chain tensioner since the new cylinder didn't come with one and the old one, still attached to the old cylinder, is in perfectly good shape. Next, be sure to generously oil the new cylinder wall. Fun fact, the shallow crossing scratch pattern that we see inside the cylinder is intentional. It will help the break-in process where the new piston rings will wear into the new cylinder, creating a matched set. Anyhow, place the new gasket on top of the crankcase and install the dowel pins. With those in place, we can carefully drop the new cylinder over the head studs. You'll need to pull the timing chain up and out and then compress each piston ring while carefully sliding the piston into the cylinder. To help keep the timing chain from sliding back down, I zip tied a pair of pliers to it. Worked great. Getting the piston inside the cylinder was actually a bit easier than I had expected. Just take your time, keep the piston square to the cylinder, and compress one piston ring at a time. I also found that wriggling it back and forth helped the rings get past the chamfer to open. Once all the piston rings are inside the lower edge of the cylinder, it should slide the rest of the way down pretty easily. Head. With the cylinder in place, we can now install the head. If you want to try to clean up any carbon deposits on your valves, now is your last chance. I used some motor oil and a brass wire brush and then a new shop towel to wipe away the resulting schmoo. It looks a little better, I guess. I suppose this would also be an ideal time to check and adjust your valve clearances, but I completely forgot about that and I didn't do or film anything related to that, so maybe in a future video? Anyhow, to install the head, start by installing the new gasket and dowel pins. Thread the timing chain up and out and then drop the head into place. Pretty easy. So easy that you might forget to install the timing chain guide like I did. I actually had the whole engine together when I found the timing chain guide on my shelf, and I was so pissed about it that I didn't even film the hour or so of disassembly and then reassembly. It's not even difficult to install, but you have to put it in after the cylinder and before the head. Anyhow, with the head and a timing chain guide in place, we can install the 2 head bolts to 7 foot-pounds and the 4 head nut and washers to 33 foot-pounds. When placing the washers, be super careful to prevent them from dropping down into the crankcase. I did this by placing the washer over a screwdriver and then holding the washer back until the tip of the screwdriver was touching the head stud, at which point I could drop the washer and be confident that it would slide into place without worrying about it going somewhere where it shouldn't. Now is a pretty convenient time to reinstall the water pipe. It goes on easy with just 2 bolts, but be sure that the O-rings are in place. Okay, so after the head is in place, we can now get ready to install the cams. First, I installed the 4 valve shims. Next, we need to ensure that the piston is at top dead center. I know it's pretty close to top dead center, but it needs to be exactly at top dead center. To check, I'm going to pull out the spark plug with a typical 16mm spark plug socket, and then drop a wooden kitchen skewer through the spark plug hole into the combustion chamber. Now I can make a mark on the skewer and rotate the crankshaft until the mark is in the absolute highest position. This is top dead center. Now we can apply molybdenum oil solution to the cam journal surfaces and get the cams in place. I was struggling to get the chain over the cams pretty bad right up until I remembered to release the cam chain tension with a small screwdriver held in place by a vice grip. After that, the cams went in much more easily. The top dead center cam position is when the IN and EX markings line up like this, and the underline is even with the top of the head. Once the chain is on, we can slather the cam holders and chain guide in molybdenum oil solution, and then torque them down to 9 foot-pounds. I reinstalled the spark plug at this point, but you could really do it anytime you feel like. The electrode gap should be between 0.31 and 0.35 inches, and the installation torque is 12 foot-pounds. Last but not least, the valve cover. This has a thick rubber gasket. I'm not sure if it actually needs silicone, but I know it had silicone on it when I pulled off the old one, so I figure I'll use some during the reinstall, because I've got a whole tube still. I acetone and wiped all of the surfaces that would come into contact with the silicone to help the silicone actually form a bond. This was most important for this spot in the middle. Anyhow, put the 2 valve cover bolts in and torque to 7 foot-pounds. Well, that's a pretty good stopping point. With any luck, this thing will actually run once I've installed it back on the bike. Thanks for watching. Hey, Tommy from the future here. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I just wanted to let you guys know it totally worked. The motor's in the frame, the bike is registered and insured, and I've been riding around like a boss. The engine reinstall video is next. Thanks for your support.